Have you ever done nothing and suddenly become unforgettable? There's a woman. She doesn't call. She doesn't chase. She doesn't post subtle quotes or selfies hoping he'll notice. In fact, she's silent. No status updates. No passive-aggressive hints. She simply withdraws. And then something strange happens. He starts to notice everything. The absence. The quiet. The way her name feels louder in his mind precisely because she stopped speaking it into the world. He replays her voice. He imagines her laugh. He remembers the way she used to say his name. Not because she reminded him, but because she stopped. This woman isn't playing games. She's not manipulating. She's simply done performing. And in that pause, something deep within him begins to ache. You see, we've been taught that to be seen, we must always be visible. To be loved, we must always be available. But what if the exact opposite is true? What if the one thing that makes a man chase is not your presence but your retreat? Carl Jung once said, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." But there's a parallel truth, rarely spoken. What you give constantly becomes invisible. What's always there becomes background noise. And what vanishes without a fight becomes a mystery he can't solve. The modern woman has been told to show up more, to prove her worth, to compete with noise, to be more accommodating, more communicative, more low maintenance. But what if the most powerful thing you could ever do is nothing? That woman at the start, she didn't withdraw out of pride. She withdrew out of presence. She didn't need to be seen. She needed to see herself again. And in doing so, she became unforgettable. Not loud, not flashy, but impossible to unfeel. Men don't talk about it, but they remember the women who disappeared with grace. The ones who didn't demand attention but left behind an energy they couldn't replicate. It haunts them, quietly. A scent in a room long after she's left. A song on the radio that doesn't hit the same anymore. Why? Because when a woman pulls her energy back, she changes the dynamic of the entire emotional ecosystem. The flow shifts, the power redistributes, and suddenly, he's no longer chasing certainty. He's chasing presence. There's a reason men come back when you've stopped waiting. It's not magic. It's not coincidence. It's psychological. It's energetic. And it's ancient. Carl Jung believed in the power of withdrawal not as a tactic, but as a transformation. He wrote about the Anima, the feminine presence within the male psyche, and how it becomes most activated, not by physical availability, but by the symbolic presence of what's missing. The Anima is not stimulated by excess. It is moved by essence. It longs for mystery. It's haunted by the unknown. And when a woman steps back into herself, into her own orbit, she triggers something he can't control. A gravitational pull that no performance could ever match. So if you've ever felt like you're doing too much, giving too often, explaining too deeply, trying too hard to make him see your worth, pause. Because maybe you're not meant to be louder. Maybe you're meant to be missed. This isn't about silence for the sake of silence. It's about reclaiming your energy, about recognizing that when you pull your focus inward, something extraordinary begins to happen outward. You no longer orbit him. You become your own sun. And suddenly, he feels the cold, because you were the warmth. And here's the twist. The moment he begins to chase, you're no longer chasing anything. You've already arrived in yourself. He's not responding to need. He's responding to sovereignty. This is not the kind of script where you beg for love. This is where love begins to beg for you. Why does silence work? Not silence as punishment, not passive-aggressive games, but the kind of silence born from awareness, the kind that doesn't scream, "Look at me," but quietly reclaims every piece of energy you've handed away. Carl Jung believed that desire, at its core, is a projection. What we crave in others is often what we've disowned in ourselves. And when someone becomes less accessible, when their energy is no longer available for easy consumption, our psyche reacts. It feels a rupture, a loss, an imbalance. That's when pursuit begins. It's not about playing hard to get. It's about becoming sovereign. It's about no longer outsourcing your self-worth. Because a woman who no longer performs for attention becomes more powerful than any seduction tactic ever could. Jung talked extensively about the Anima, the inner feminine presence within the male unconscious. This archetype is not stimulated by noise. It is drawn to mystery, to depth, to what cannot be possessed. The Anima is awakened when the masculine encounters a feminine force that cannot be captured. When you pull back your energy, you stop being an extension of his ego gratification. You stop reflecting what he wants to see, and in that moment, he is forced to feel, to wonder, to confront the empty space where your energy used to be. That space is not absence. It's activation. Think of it this way. We rarely notice the air we breathe until it's gone. We take for granted what is constant. But remove it, and suddenly, every breath becomes urgent. Every silence becomes a question. Every memory turns into an echo that won't leave him alone. When you stop giving, stop explaining, stop managing how he perceives you, you become unpredictable. And that unpredictability breaks his control. It pierces through his comfort. It unsettles him in the way all real transformation does. Jung once said, "Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious." And nothing presses upward faster than a loss that doesn't make sense. Because here's the truth most people avoid. Men don't fall in love with your presence. They fall in love with what your absence reveals. When you are always available, always affirming, always waiting, he doesn't have to feel anything. He can coast on the comfort of knowing you're there. He doesn't have to question. He doesn't have to act. He doesn't have to evolve. But take that away, and suddenly, everything changes. He begins to wonder, to question, to imagine, because his unconscious now has to make sense of the shift. It starts pulling memories, replaying conversations. It begins to ask, why does her silence feel louder than her words ever did? This is where desire is born not from access, but from interruption. Your silence becomes a mirror. Not one that reflects him, but one that reveals him. His patterns, his fears, his shadows. The parts of himself he was able to ignore when you were too busy trying to be enough. Jung believed that true connection cannot happen without the dissolution of ego. And nothing dissolves the ego faster than not getting what it expects. That's what feminine energy does when it detaches. It doesn't punish. It disturbs. It disturbs the man who thought he had you figured out. The one who thought he could come and go as he pleased. The one who relied on your presence to avoid meeting himself. When you step back, it's not about absence. It's about essence. You become what he cannot define, and that makes you unforgettable. Let's be honest. In today's world, we're addicted to noise, to response, to feedback. We measure love by how quickly someone replies, how many emojis they send, how available they are on demand. But Jung would challenge that. He'd say, look deeper. What if the real connection begins when you stop responding? What if your silence isn't rejection, but refinement? What if doing nothing is exactly what awakens everything? When a woman steps into her stillness not out of fear, but out of fullness, she doesn't chase, she doesn't beg, she doesn't try to prove. And yet, she begins to attract what once eluded her. Because her energy is no longer leaking. She's not broadcasting her worth. She's embodying it. There's a reason why certain women become unforgettable after they walk away. It's not because they were the most beautiful, the funniest, or the most agreeable. It's because their withdrawal created a void that revealed the man's unconscious needs, wounds, and longings. The feminine mystery is not a performance. It is a frequency. A woman in her power doesn't shout. She resonates. And in that resonance, men remember. They reevaluate. They recalibrate. Not because you tried to change them, but because your absence changed the dynamic. Jung taught that transformation begins with disruption. When a woman stops giving her energy to someone who hasn't earned it, she disrupts the pattern. And in doing so, she becomes the catalyst not for manipulation, but for awakening. So if you're wondering why doing nothing works, now you know. Because doing nothing isn't empty. It's a powerful signal. It says, I've stopped trying to be enough for you, because I've finally become enough for myself. And from that place, he doesn't chase you because you disappeared. He chases you because, for the first time, he sees you clearly. Not as a reflection of his needs, but as a woman who needs no one to complete her. And that, more than anything, is the one thing he can't resist. There is a quiet tragedy that happens when you're always there. It doesn't start with drama. It doesn't announce itself. It slips in unnoticed, like a slow leak in your sense of self. You answer the call. You send the message. You make space. You make time. You're available emotionally, physically, energetically, always. At first, it feels noble, generous, loving, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift. He stops saying thank you. He stops noticing the effort. He stops trying. Not because you changed, but because you never made him earn anything. Carl Jung wrote that, "What you resist persists, but there's a more dangerous pattern. What you overgive disappears. Not literally, but symbolically. When you are always available, your value begins to evaporate not in reality, but in perception. And in relationships. Perception is everything. Your constant presence becomes assumed, expected, unquestioned, and then, inevitably unappreciated. We live in a culture that equates love with sacrifice. You were taught that to be loved, you must always be accessible. That saying yes makes you good. That availability equals devotion. But here's the truth. Over-availability is not love. It's self-erasure. You lose yourself one accommodation at a time. You suppress your needs. You quiet your boundaries. You shape yourself around someone else's comfort. And every time you do it, a part of you retreats into shadow. Jung called the shadow the unconscious repository of everything we deny in ourselves. The desires we silence, the anger we swallow, the intuition we ignore. And when you're always available, you are constantly pushing your truth into that shadow, hiding it under smiles, under patience, under, "I'm fine." But the shadow does not stay buried. It leaks. It seeps into your body as exhaustion, into your mind as resentment, into your energy as emotional burnout, into your relationships as confusion, because you are no longer showing up as your whole self. You're showing up as your functional self, the self who smooths everything over, the self who doesn't make demands, the self who loves quietly, invisibly, self-destructively. And here's the irony. The more available you are, the less impact you have. Your yes means less because it is never preceded by a no. Your affection is taken for granted because it is never missing long enough to be missed. Your presence loses weight because it is always present. Do you understand how devastating that is? To be overlooked not because you lack value, but because you never allowed that value to be felt through absence. Jung believed that psychic energy, your emotional, mental, and spiritual attention is limited, and wherever you direct it, you create a bond. But when you direct it constantly outward, towards someone who is not reciprocating, you deplete yourself. And depletion, over time, becomes invisibility. You become the background music of his life, soothing, familiar, and slowly tuned out. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time he leaned in, curious? When was the last time he asked about your silence, instead of just assuming your words would be there? When was the last time you didn't show up, and he noticed? If the answer is never, the issue is not that you are not enough. The issue is that you've given too much without ever stepping back. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Many women live out this dynamic without even knowing why. They think it's loyalty. They think it's love. But really, it's conditioning. A deeply rooted fear that if they are not always there, they will be forgotten. So they overextend, they overcommit, they overperform, and in doing so, they become overexposed. Overexposure breeds desensitization, and desensitization kills desire. This is not a call to become cold. This is a call to become conscious. To understand that your energy is not infinite, and the way you allocate it teaches people how to treat you. If you are always accessible, you will never be prioritized. Because urgency does not exist without boundaries. Desire does not exist without distance. Value does not exist without scarcity. Let that sink in. The very act of always being available erodes the conditions necessary for true connection. You rob the other person of the opportunity to feel your absence, to miss you, to reach for you, to choose you. And in turn, you rob yourself of the joy of being chosen freely. This is not just romantic, this is archetypal. Jung understood that the feminine carries an ancient wisdom, the capacity to receive, to contain, to attract through presence, not pursuit. But when that feminine energy is distorted into constant giving, it collapses under its own weight. It becomes servitude, not sovereignty. You were not meant to be a bottomless well of validation. You were not meant to be an emotional vending machine. You were not meant to be on call for someone who would not walk through fire to reach you. If you feel resentment building, it is a signal. If you feel unseen, it is not your failure, it is a call to withdraw. To stop feeding a dynamic that drains you. To stop pouring into a container that leaks. Because the moment you pull your energy back not as a strategy, but as a sacred act of self-respect, everything begins to shift. He might panic. He might chase. He might finally notice. But the deeper truth is this. Your value does not increase when he starts chasing. Your value was always there. You just stopped putting it on clearance. This is where you begin to reclaim your worth. Not by demanding it, but by embodying it, by showing up less, by saying no more, by being silent when the urge to explain rises. Because sometimes the most powerful sentence is the one you do not speak. Not as a weapon, but as a boundary. Not to punish him, but to preserve yourself. You are not here to be everything to someone who gives you nothing. You are not here to prove your worth through availability. You are here to remember that your presence is a privilege, not a promise. And until you live like that, no one will treat it as such. So the next time you feel the urge to respond immediately, to say yes when you mean maybe, to show up just to be seen, pause. And ask yourself, am I offering this out of love? Or out of fear that if I don't, I'll disappear? Because the truth is, the only thing that truly disappears is your power, the moment you give yourself away too easily. What if I told you that one decision, not a dramatic confrontation, not a clever reply, not a carefully designed plan can change everything? Not just how he sees you, but how you see yourself. That decision is simple, but not easy. It is not loud. It is not celebrated. You will not get applause for it. No one will call you brave for doing it. In fact, many will misinterpret it as weakness, as coldness, as giving up. But they will be wrong, because this one action is not about defeat. It is about power. Stop searching. That's it. Stop searching for signs, for reassurance, for proof that you matter. Stop checking your phone. Stop decoding silence. Stop adjusting yourself in hopes that he might finally look at you and realize what he has. Because he won't, not while you're trying to make him see. Carl Jung once said that what you seek is seeking you, but here's the catch: it can only find you when you stop chasing, when you turn inward, when your energy stops leaking outward into a world that doesn't know what to do with it. The shift begins when you withdraw, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to reclaim. When you stop filling the silence, he begins to hear it. When you stop filling the space, he begins to feel the absence. When you stop proving your worth, he is left to face his own inability to recognize value. This is not about disappearing. It is about detaching. There is a difference. Disappearing is rooted in fear. Detachment is rooted in dignity. You're not walking away to make a point. You're walking back to yourself because you've realized that the longer you stay in a space where you're not seen, the more invisible you become to yourself. And that is a cost you can no longer afford. You see, we've been conditioned to believe that if something matters, we must fight for it. But what if the real fight is the one we have with our own fear of letting go? What if the only battle worth waging is the one against the lie that love must be earned through suffering? The one thing, the action that changes everything, is the moment you stop waiting to be chosen. Because here is the truth no one wants to say out loud. Men don't fall in love with women who overextend. They don't commit to the ones who never leave. They don't value the woman who is always there to fill the silence, solve the problem, soothe the wound. They remember the one who stepped away, the one who did not make noise when ignored, The one who didn't argue to be understood. The one who, instead of begging for love, became it. You cannot shift the dynamic of any relationship until you remove your energy from a place where it is being drained, until you stop acting like someone who needs to be convinced she's worthy, until you remember who you were before you made yourself smaller for someone else's comfort. That's the moment everything starts to turn. He will feel it, not immediately, not with certainty, but subtly. A pause, an emptiness, a tension in the air where your presence used to be, and in that space, something ancient activates. Jung believed that the unconscious mind responds to symbols more than language. The symbol of absence, the empty chair, the unread message, the unanswered call carries more weight than any emotional speech you could ever give. And if there's any part of him capable of awakening, that's the moment it begins. But this is not about him. It never was. The real revolution happens inside of you. You stop asking questions that keep you small. Does he love me? Why hasn't he texted? What did I do wrong? And you start asking bigger questions. Why have I stayed this long in uncertainty? Why am I addicted to proving myself? Why do I confuse being wanted with being valued? These are not easy questions, but they are the right ones. And asking them is an act of self-devotion. It is you turning the gaze away from him and back to the woman who has always been there, quietly waiting to be seen by her own eyes. That's the one thing. You stop waiting, and you start watching. Not him. Yourself. You watch how your body relaxes when you stop trying to perform. You watch how your mind clears when you stop rehearsing conversations. You watch how your energy returns when you stop sending it where it is not cherished. And in that watching, a miracle happens. You begin to feel again, not the rush of being chosen, but the peace of no longer needing to be. That is the shift. It is quiet. It is internal, but it is seismic. Because once you've tasted what it feels like to be full in your own presence, you will never again settle for the crumbs of conditional affection. Men notice when the performance ends, when the warmth they depended on is no longer theirs to touch, when the woman who once waited with bated breath now walks with grounded calm. They notice, and they chase. But here's the twist. By the time they do, you've already changed. You are no longer waiting. You are choosing. And this time, you're choosing differently. Not from loneliness, not from fear, not from a desire to prove, but from clarity, from wholeness, from the knowing that love is not a pursuit, it is a presence. And it begins with yours. So stop searching, not because love doesn't exist, but because you've spent too long searching in places that couldn't hold you. Withdraw, not because you want revenge, but because your soul is tired of begging for crumbs. Reclaim your energy, not to make him chase you, but because you've realized that everything you were seeking in him was already inside you, waiting for you to come home, and now you're finally on your way. Something shifts when a woman stops orbiting, not just in her relationships, in her entire life. Because when a woman becomes the center of her own world, everything else realigns. The noise falls away. The confusion clears. And suddenly, the man who once pulled her off balance begins to feel gravity pulling the other way. But here's the truth most never see coming. By the time he comes back, she is no longer waiting. This is not a story about revenge. It is not a performance designed to manipulate. This is about becoming whole again, returning to the center of your own life. Not because you want to prove something, but because you're finally ready to live from truth, not survival. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Most women spend years being everything to everyone's supporter, caretaker, lover, rescuer. They mold themselves into shapes that fit other people's needs. They apologize for their boundaries. They explain their standards. They quiet their intuition just to feel chosen. But eventually, something breaks. Not in despair, but in awakening. She stops running. She stops chasing. She stops managing someone else's potential and finally turns that energy inward. And that's where the alchemy begins. When a woman returns to herself, the world feels it. Her silence is no longer absence. It becomes presence. Her calm no longer invites manipulation. It demands respect. And the man who once relied on her being endlessly available begins to feel an unfamiliar discomfort. the absence of control. Because now she is no longer accessible by default. Now she chooses. She doesn't chase energy. She reads it. She doesn't beg for space. She becomes the room. She doesn't wait for someone to give her worth. She arrives already full. And that fullness, that self-possession, that anchored feminine energy pulls, not by force, but by frequency, not by seduction, but by sovereignty. When a woman lives from her center, she becomes magnetic in a way that no game or strategy could ever replicate. And yes, he might come back. But here's the question that matters far more. Will you still want him? Because a woman who has met herself at the center is no longer attracted to anything that pulls her away from it. She doesn't want drama. She wants depth. She doesn't want attention. She wants alignment. She doesn't want someone to complete her. She wants someone to meet her on equal ground, from a full heart, with a clear presence. So if you've been waiting for a sign to stop waiting, let this be it. You don't need to do more. You don't need to give more. You don't need to contort yourself into a version of you that feels acceptable enough to be chosen. You are not here to be chosen. You are here to choose. To choose your peace over performance. To choose your presence over proving. To choose your soul over survival. When you do that, when you sit quietly at the center of your own life, something powerful begins to unfold. The right people feel it. The wrong ones fall away. The ones who cannot meet you where you've gone will no longer feel like a loss. And the one who once overlooked you may try to return, but this time, the energy has shifted. You are not waiting with open wounds. You are standing with open eyes. You don't need closure. You don't need apologies. You don't need anything outside of you to complete the story. You have already written the ending. Or maybe the beginning. Because this is where your real life starts, not from being chosen, but from being conscious. And now, I want to leave you with something deeper than advice. A question. What happens when you stop running after love and start walking toward yourself? What kind of woman would you become if you stopped explaining your worth and started embodying it? What would shift in your energy, your relationships, your future, if you simply allowed yourself to be the center? Whatever comes up, I invite you to sit with it, write about it, feel it fully. And if something in this message resonated, if you saw yourself even in one sentence, then this space is for you. Leave a comment below. You don't have to say much. A single sentence is enough. Maybe just, I see myself in this, or I'm done waiting, because your voice matters. And sometimes, giving it space is the most radical act of love you can offer yourself. If you want more content like this grounded, honest, healing, real, make sure to subscribe. This is more than a channel. It's a conversation, and your presence here changes it. Share this with a woman who needs to remember her power. Someone who forgot that being still can be a form of strength. That doing nothing can sometimes be the most powerful action of all. And finally, if you've come this far, know this. You're not broken. You're becoming. You're not behind. You're returning. You're not too much. You are finally just enough for yourself. Stay centered. The ones who can meet you there will find you, and the rest will fade away without a sound.